This is a short lecture about Tintern Abbey to prepare for us talking about the poem on Monday. If you go to Tintern Abbey in Wales, just outside of England, just to the west of England, you'll see something like this today. The river on the right is the Wye River, W-Y-E. It's flowing downward towards us, towards the Bristol Channel. And the abbey is one of these great Catholic abbeys built in the 13th and 14th centuries on rich farmland and ruined by Henry VIII during the Reformation during the change from the Catholic faith. The poem that we call Tintern Abbey is in fact not called that by Wordsworth. It is called Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey. So in fact, the Abbey, which was even in Wordsworth's day in 1798 when the poem was written, a major tourist event, site, does not figure in the poem at all. So it's a sort of a common misconception that the poem is in fact about this beautiful ruined abbey, which here is seen in a romantic view before being cleaned up with a party of picnickers and tourists in the late 18th century. You can see it was a favorite romantic place, and I'd expect a romantic poem to be about that abbey. Here's how it looks today. But in fact, it's not. It is in fact about the River Wye above Tintern Abbey, several miles above Tintern Abbey, as Wordsworth visited it twice. Here's a picture. Here's a map showing London, and here the Severn River, major port city of Bristol, and here is Tintern Abbey, a close-up of that area. Here again is the Severn. Bristol is down here, and this is the Wye Valley, coming from the town of Monmouth, flowing down out of the Welsh hills, past Tintern Abbey to the Severn. In Wordsworth's day in 1798, in fact, Tintern Abbey was a major source of early industrial activity. Many charcoal makers were chopping trees down in the hills above the Wye, shipping the wood down towards Tintern Abbey where it was made into charcoal, and used in a number of iron forges that surrounded Tintern Abbey. The pastoral landscape that Wordsworth talks about in the poem is up here to the north of Tintern Abbey, upstream from it, where the river is no longer navigable, it's not tidal, and is in fact much less industrial than the area down here in the tidal navigable area in Wordsworth's time. This is just a tourist picture of what that upper valley of the Wye looks like, another one. And I think you can link that with the early parts of Tintern Abbey, the poem. The cliffs, the seclusion, the sense of pastoral and verdant forest. Wordsworth's poem is about the young Wordsworth and by the young Wordsworth. This is Wordsworth probably in 1798 when he was 28 years old. And the poem itself is dated, as you can see by the title, in 1798 very explicitly. In 1793, while still at university, he had visited Tintern Abbey alone and been deeply impressed by its beauty. After that, he lived in London for a number of years, roughly 5 years, to the point of disgust with the city. And it is the 5 years later revisiting to Tintern. He's living fairly close by, near Bristol at this point, working with Coleridge to create their first joint volume, Lyrical Ballads, in which Tintern Abbey appears, the poem Tintern Abbey appears as the last entry, put in just before the poem was printed and sold in 1798. Wordsworth is said to have visited Tintern Abbey on a walking visit, on a walking tour from the Bristol area. Again, back to our map. Bristol's down here. They would have probably, I think there was no bridge, they would have taken a boat across the Severn and then walked up Tintern Abbey and back to Bristol. The walk back to Bristol would have taken about 2 days, and it is said that during that time, Wordsworth composed the entirety of the poem in his head, came back to Bristol, wrote it down, and gave it to the printer. I think you can tell that the poem has that quality of walkingness. It is a remarkably fluent poem. While it's in verse, the verse does not rhyme. The verses are not broken up by rhyme, but are continuous in long strides. Wordsworth was a very tall man, and he walked in long strides. Tintern Abbey can be seen as a crisis poem, a poem about the crisis in the life of the young Wordsworth, his struggles to achieve that, and his concerns with what that crisis was about and what it meant to him, what it might mean to his sister Dorothy, and what it might mean to the world, and how nature could connect with that. So as you think about the poem, read it several times. Read it out loud if you can get around to it. I want you to think about these questions. What is the crisis that is delineated in the poem? How is it delineated? What kind of form does the crisis take? Whom does it affect? And secondly, what alleviates that crisis? That is, what steps in to make it endurable or understandable, or even perhaps desirable. In what way does it become not a debilitating event, but an event in the life of a person, a group, a family, a relationship, perhaps even a nation? And thirdly, what does the poem suggest that one can do about the crises that almost certainly lie ahead of us in the future? What makes those bearable? What makes those important? What makes them possible as a part of our lives? So I'd like you to think about those issues, and I would ask you to come away from your reading and come to class on Monday with just one phrase from the poem that you think is key to talking about one of those questions about the crisis. What one phrase, a few words, would you draw from the poem and bring to our class discussion?